Hello YouTube, it's Michael Gallagher, the Media Preacher. I want to start this video by thanking everybody who has subscribed to the channel over the last few months. I have been absent, I haven't been able to make as many videos as I would have liked to have made, but nevertheless, the subscriber count is slowly on the rise, and I thank you all for tuning in and watching the content that I'm producing on the channel. And I would encourage anybody who's looking at my videos, please hit that subscribe button, because you don't know what a motivator it is to carry on doing some reviews and discussions of different media related products, which really is the whole emphasis of the YouTube channel that I'm trying to create. Anyway, moving on, I think it's time for me now to do another album review. I haven't done an album review for a few months, and I was looking through the collection trying to look at an album that I thought really was deserving of a discussion. And there's one album, as I was flicking through all of the CDs that I own, that really stands out as being something of a lost gem. It certainly was for many, many years. I think it's been rediscovered in many respects by my generation, because it was re-released really for my generation, and I think it's become an album in many respects of my generation, because it was a lost album on the generation that it was actually made for. The album that I'm going to be referring to was an album that was recorded between 1971 and 1977, which was a long recording process. But I think that the artist who wrote the songs and performed the songs on this album actually gave himself enough time to produce a fine album and real quality material to release on the public. Now, the artist that I'm going to be referring to was formerly a member of a very, very big group. He was a member of the Beach Boys. And no, I'm not talking about Brian Wilson. I'm talking about his brother Dennis Wilson and the album that he released in 1977, Pacific Ocean Blue. Sadly, I do not own a copy of this on vinyl. I would love to have a copy of it on vinyl, but the original presses are very, very hard to come by. I'll go into that later in the review. And you can pick it up, to be fair, from HMV for a reasonable price. But I picked up this CD here from HMV for £3, and you really can't say any fairer than that, because I wanted to just sort of dip my toe into the water with it. But man, this is a fantastic album that has got some real quality and deep songwriting on it. As I understand it, the album, the genesis of the album really comes about because Dennis Wilson was not a star, of course, of the Beach Boys. He was the drummer, and he was only really the drummer, as I understand it, for a lot of the live shows, because certainly on Pet Sounds and on the other big Beach Boys albums that are really well known, actually Brian Wilson used session musicians, including a session drummer in respect of those albums. I think he used the Wrecking Crew, didn't he? But Dennis Wilson was nevertheless part of the Beach Boys. I think he loved the music that they'd been creating, but I think that he'd become slightly disillusioned maybe with some of the music that they were creating, because he felt that the group were arguing amongst themselves. He felt that the tensions in the group were putting a bit of a blight on the music that they'd been making. And as I understand it, he'd been taking time out with Brian at different shows and asking Brian to show him some chords and things on the piano. And Brian was quite happy to show him chords. And Dennis Wilson had been essentially learning to play the piano while he was touring with the Beach Boys. Now, Dennis Wilson recorded this album, I think, at his home studio. Obviously, he's very fortunate. He had a lot of wealth, presumably, from his association with the Beach Boys. And he was able to create himself a studio that today you could create on a laptop. But back in 1971, it must have cost tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds to put a studio of the calibre that he used to record this album together. But as I understand it, the songs grew from him using the studio and understanding the studio and learning to play principally keyboard type instruments, mainly the piano, quite a lot of Fender Rhodes on this album and sort of electric type piano sounds, which are fantastic. But he was obviously learning as he was going along, and you can hear that progression in the album. I think from 1971 to sort of the mid-70s, it was really a rudderless ship. He was just writing songs, recording as and when with various musicians to try and help realise his ambitions. But ultimately he did secure a recording contract, and I think it was made a condition of him being advanced money on the recording contract that he adhered to a strict and structured recording process, presumably because the owners of the label were concerned that this wasn't a project that Dennis was perhaps taking seriously. And of course, Dennis's life at this point as well was marred by his use of alcohol and drugs, and so I imagine that his recording process was haphazard at best. But nevertheless, he was producing fantastic fantastic songs. In 1977, the album was finally finished. It was delivered to the label, who released it, and initially the album gets fantastic reviews from all the reviewers of the day. Rolling Stone give it a fantastic review. It really is hailed when it comes out as being a really great piece of work. For some reason though, the public didn't buy into this album at the time. It peaked at number 96 on the Billboard charts. It sold less, and this is unbelievable, but it actually sold less than 5,000 copies. Its masterpiece of an album sells less than 5,000 copies on its release. Dennis Wilson, as I understand it, actually had a tour that he had prepared to tour the album and to promote it. But as a result of the poor album sales, that tour got pulled. And as I understand it, Dennis himself then started to declare that the album had, quote, no substance. From reading all about this, he lost all faith in the album himself. And I don't know why, because the album is absolutely fantastic. Was it perhaps a crisis of faith or a crisis of confidence? Or was it the fact that Dennis was perhaps indulging too much in alcohol and drugs to be able to have a proper listen to the album and to know what he really had on his hands? But nevertheless, the tour got cancelled. Poor album sales resulted in next to no promotion. Even though it had great reviews, I think that the label themselves then stopped promoting the album. And as I say, it really just faded into obscurity because the album wasn't repressed and repressed like other classic albums of the 70s. In fact, I think it was unavailable for many, many years, and it was released on CD in 1991 in a very limited run. But when I say that was a limited run, as I understand it, that CD was very, very hard to find and was put out of print almost immediately. So that explains why you won't see many people with an original pressing of this album or even an original CD pressing of this album, because it simply wasn't pressed in great quantities, and it was, certainly for a period of time, very, very, very hard to come by. But nevertheless, the great reviews that it garnered when it was released, are absolutely well deserved. I mean, when you go through the album, it starts with an absolute killer track called River Song, and Dennis Wilson is really showing his piano chops in this, and it's the art of simplicity, because what he's taking essentially is an arpeggiated chord and making this wonderful sort of rhythm with it. If I just sort of show you what I mean, if I turn over to the piano. Just a simple arpeggiated chord thing, it's brilliant. Then he comes in with down by the river, water running to my knees, river by the river, water running to my knees. And he goes to this, oh lonely river, you might come to be with me, oh lonely river, you might come to see. Back into the arpeggiated chord. Awesome. So you've got that wonderful arpeggiated B flat chord, followed by an E flat chord, which is really simple, but really, really effective for what Dennis was trying to create with that first track. And it's just such an epic opener to the album. You then go on, you've got tracks like Moonshine, which is beautiful. And then you've got tracks that are really sort of soul tracks, really, but with sort of a funk infusion. They almost remind me in some respects of like a Stevie Wonder type song. The title track, Pacific Ocean Blue, is like this sort of funky, soul-y blues track that is just amazing. And when you put it on and you listen to it, you think, man, how did this album not sell in massive quantities when it was released? The other great thing I think about the album as well is that it's not derivative of the Beach Boys. It's not derivative of Brian Wilson. I mean, that piano interlude there is a really good example. That's not something I think that you'd hear Brian Wilson write. And what Dennis did was he was perhaps underestimated. And you're always best, I think, to be underestimated, because nobody was expecting his album to have the sound that it had. And certainly when I listened to it, perhaps because of the Beach Boys association, the first time I listened to it, I expected it to sound like a Brian Wilson type album. And of course it really doesn't. And I think that Dennis really crafts his own piece of artwork. And it's a fantastic piece of artwork. The other thing about the album that I think is absolutely fantastic is the production value, because it was ultimately recorded, as I say, in Dennis's home studio, but it sounds absolutely fantastic, particularly the piano and drum sounds. I think the piano and drum sound on this album is up there with the best piano and drum sounds ever recorded, and they really sound full and rich and creamy. Interesting thing about the drums in this album, I don't think they're played by Dennis Wilson, despite the fact he was the drummer, of course, in the Beach Boys. They're played by the drummer from the Wrecking Crew, who played on most of the Beach Boys albums. I don't know why Dennis didn't do the drums himself. Perhaps he wanted to track everything together, and he wanted sort of to have that band-type cohesive sound that was going on. But a really great production on this album. I think it was marred, and I think his career was probably marred by his use of drugs and alcohol, which certainly after the album was released spiraled very, very badly. I know he also had lots of issues with his throat that I think were probably also related to his substance misuse, which is a terrible shame because those things probably fueled the fact that he didn't have any faith in the album, he didn't promote the album, he didn't tour the album. Then that probably then fueled or failed to fuel his confidence any further, and you end up without having a proper successor to this album because it's a standalone studio album. Dennis did do other recordings. There are recordings on the internet. There's the Cocaine sessions with Brian Wilson. I haven't heard them yet, so please give me your thoughts on those. He also recorded a second album, essentially, called Bamboo. And that really ties into what happens with this album because it has a resurgence, and it has a resurgence for my generation. So the album is lost. As I say, it's released initially, sells less than 5,000 copies, then it's released on CD in 1991, and I think there were rights issues with it, but it got pulled then as well. In 2008, Sony decided to give it its just desserts, really, and they release it as part of their Legacy collection. Now, they released this album that I bought from HMV, but they also released a 2-disc version of the album, which a friend of mine lent me, and the 2-disc version of the album actually has what is essentially Dennis Wilson's second album as the bonus CD feature. I don't personally think that the second album, I think it's entitled Bamboo, is as good as this. But it's certainly really, really cool to have, and I would like to have heard that as a finished product. But the 2008 Legacy release gave the album a new lease of life. And I think the album by that point had sort of created this mystique almost around it. And when it was released in 2008, the BBC 4 also produced a documentary which helped to promote it. And I think it actually achieved number 16 on the album charts when it was re-released. Sadly, of course, Dennis Wilson never lived to see the success of his solo work because of his issues. I think he had an accident in about 1983, whereby in some sort of alcohol and drug-induced state, he was essentially homeless. He was living on a boat. And I think some items that had been lost in the sea just off the boat a few years before, he had it in his mind were in the sea, and he jumped into the sea, and ultimately, because of the state he was in, he drowned. And we lost a real artist and someone who had great potential that, whilst that potential was, I think, realised in this album, it was probably never realised to its fullest because Dennis Wilson never got to release anything properly other than Pacific Ocean Blue. I mean, he did clearly lead a very hectic and strange lifestyle, had lots of money, abused that money, and had people probably abuse the money as well for him. I mean, there's a really interesting story about how in the late 60s, prior to writing the album, he comes across two women on a road trip, and he takes the two women back to his house. And they then call their friend, who turns out is Charles Manson. And the Manson family end up living, apparently, with Dennis Wilson for quite a long period of time. And Dennis Wilson funded their lifestyle for quite a long period of time. I was reading on the internet that actually Dennis Wilson spent over £100,000, which in the $100,000, sorry, which of course in the late 60s would have been a massive amount of money, in order to buy them penicillin to treat their sexually transmitted disease that they were passing to each other. So they were obviously living this strange lifestyle, and we know what the Manson family then went on to do. And I think that was probably indicative of the way Dennis Wilson lived his life. Easy come, easy go. He'd invite people in, he'd get high, he'd get drunk. And I think that's probably why when he was given that recording contract, he was told, look, if you're going to deliver the album to us and we're going to pay you for it, then we need to know that you are going to deliver that album properly, which is why they wanted that structured process towards providing it. But ultimately what Dennis Wilson did was provide a lost gem. I mean, it's a classic album, and it deserves to be rated with some of the best albums, I think, that were released in the 70s. The fact that it didn't sell, the fact that it was lost, in some respects is criminal. In other respects, perhaps, is part and parcel of the problems that Dennis Wilson faced and the issues that he faced throughout his life. It might have been a symptom rather than the cause, obviously, but clearly a real indicator that all was not well in his camp. And that's a shame because, as I say, he had a lot of talent. He obviously picked up the piano very quickly, and he delivers songs in this album that are timeless. And I think that if anybody is thinking about listening to the album or is thinking about perhaps picking a copy up, if you see a copy of this album, please pick it up. Please give it a spin, because it's a real treat. And I think it will surprise you. You don't have to like the Beach Boys to like this album. As I say, if you like soul and funk, I think you'd like this album as well. So anyway, I would absolutely pick this album up. I would give it a listen to. If you enjoyed the review, please subscribe. Until next time, this is Michael Gallagher, the Media Preacher, signing off.